Welcome to today's webinar, Charities Lean Forward, Strengthen Your Charities Against Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing. This webinar is organized by Pro Bono SG in collaboration with the Office of the Commissioner of Charities. My name is Regana and I will be your moderator today. Before we begin, here are some housekeeping matters to take note of. If you have any queries or concerns regarding your donations, please refer to the recent advisory circulated by the Office of the Commissioner of Charities, or you can email to mccy_charities@mccy.gov.sg. And finally, please note that today's discussion is not intended to substitute for any form of professional legal advice. If you do require specific legal advice, please consult a lawyer. Okay, let's start proper. Today we have a packed program that promises to keep you engaged from start to finish. We are kicking things off with an opening address by the Commissioner of Charities himself, Mr. Desmond Chin. We will then learn more about anti-money laundering and suspicious transaction reporting, or SRT for short, by a sharing from Ms. Au Xiaoting and Mr. Lim Jun Yang from the Singapore Police Force. This will be followed by an empowering session on knowing your legal rights as a charity by Mr. Danny Ong, Managing Director of Setia Law. To round up the webinar, we have a power-packed panel of experts that will walk us through case scenarios. Now, these case scenarios have been created based on the questions that you have sent us, and then we will wrap up with a Q&A session. So it is with immense pleasure I extend a warm welcome to the Commissioner of Charities, Mr. Desmond Chin, to give the opening address. Mr. Chin.
Thanks, Regana. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today's session was organized because of the ongoing money laundering case, and we have found that many charities have been raising questions as to how they can conduct the due diligence checks. They've been asking about how they can adopt measures to safeguard themselves against abuse of money laundering, as well as whether or not there are any resources that they can tap on to do so. So we thought that it's best that we have this webinar and to address these queries directly. But first, before we begin, I'd like to express my appreciation to Pro Bono Singapore for co-organizing this webinar. They have been doing a great job in organizing several other webinars with us, and this is no different. We also like to thank CAD and police of the police force, Xiaoting and Junyuan, for they will be sharing with us on anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism and suspicious transaction reporting later on. Then we have our distinguished speakers and panel, Danny, Dennis, and Benjamin, who are practitioners in their field, and they will be sharing with us their insights as well. And of course, I'd like to thank Regana for moderating the session. She's an excellent moderator. Now, Singapore's status as a major global financial hub makes us very vulnerable as a transit point for ML, or money laundering. And Singapore, as you know, has zero tolerance for ML and TF, which is terrorist financing. Fortunately for us, we have had little evidence so far that our charities have been exploited by money laundering personnel or terrorist organizations. But we must not let our guard down, because our charity sector can remain vulnerable to abuse, given the inherent risks to fundraising, as well as some of the locations in which our charities operate. If money laundering or terrorist financing involving charities were to happen in Singapore, hypothetically, if it happens, then it would have an adverse impact on the charity sector. I can see a few things that will happen. One, there will be an erosion of public trust. Secondly, donors will be dissuaded to donate further, at least for a time. I think our charities' fundraising efforts will be impeded, and some of our charities, if affected, their services and their programs will also be affected, and needless to say, the beneficiaries will suffer. So we must not let this happen. We need to be on guard and don't let this happen to any of our charities in Singapore as far as we can help it. Now, how do criminals make use of charities in their money laundering or terrorist financing efforts? I have had the opportunity to discuss and to read some of the cases that happen in overseas jurisdictions. I'd just like to share some very quickly. I think the police will share a little more later on. Some criminals will donate to charities using illicit funds, and then after that, they'll make very unusual requests to redirect the funds for purposes that are obviously incongruent with the charity's objectives. Sometimes these criminals will then ask for bought seats or strange favors in return for the donations that they have made. Secondly, some terrorist organizations leverage on the charity's facilities and funded activities to promote their own recruitment of members into their own terrorist organizations. And thirdly, some criminals will misuse the name of a legitimate charity to organize fundraising events, but with the intention of misleading the public to donate to a charitable cause. The next question we need to ask ourselves then, can our charities become vulnerable to such abuse? And the answer is obviously we can if 5 things happen. First, if our charities have very weak internal controls and very poor financial administrative practices, then such things can happen. Secondly, if our charities fail to reject donors whose donations are attached to a string of very questionable conditions, even though we know it, but we accept it, then we have a problem. Thirdly, if our charities accept suspicious donations, even though they have sufficient evidence and cause for concern. The fourth kind of charities that can make yourself vulnerable is if you have but do not put in practice your anti-money laundering and your counter financing for terrorism policies and procedures. You have these, but you don't put them in practice, they are for show. And the last group are those that are not even aware of what money laundering and terrorist financing means. But I'm glad all of you are here today, so I'm quite sure you now know what that means. Now, recently, the Office of the Commissioner of Charities had sent out an advisory to all charities in response to this money laundering probe. Some of our charities may have received donations from the persons of interest or related entities. Now, I would like to urge you to do the following as soon as possible. First, would you please review your donor records from January 2019 onwards against the list of the persons of interest and those that have been published in the various media reports. Secondly, we would appreciate it if you could submit the required Form SG to my office after completing your review, so you can inform us of your findings. Thirdly, very importantly, please file a suspicious transaction report if your charity suspects or identifies donations that have been received from the POIs, persons of interest, or their related entities. The police will be sharing on how we can file such STR reports later. Now, charities that have received donations from the persons of interest or related entities should now carefully consider your next steps and actions that you'll take in respect of these donations received. You'll need to bear in mind the potential legal as well as reputational risk to your charities if it comes to light that your charity had accepted these donations knowingly or unknowingly from these POIs or related entities. Your board members should discuss the matter among yourselves and then clearly document the proceedings and the decisions that you make finally. It is up to your board to decide what is in the best interest of your charity as you know your charity best. So I think it's important that you consider whether to return or to keep and etc. How will it affect your charity, especially your donors, present and future. I understand some charities had already decided to ring fence these donations. They have also filed police reports and STRs, and they plan to surrender the money to the police. I'd like to thank these charities that have responded so promptly to the advisory. So how can charities protect themselves against money laundering and terrorist financing? Now, while we have, Singapore has steadily and systematically built up our anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism regime over the years to prevent such things from happening, the charity sector, as I said earlier, is not immune to these crimes. You may have read 2 recent articles that was published in the Straits Times on 21st of October this year The first article, entitled Hard for Volunteer-Run Charities to Identify Money Laundering Donors, was written by Ms. Marian Ho and Mr. Loh Kiaming. They had made several suggestions, including having an AML policy standard or toolkit. Number two, creating a shared database on suspicious donors. And thirdly, having greater support for the accounting, corporate secretariat, and legal communities for the charity sector. There was a second article, just below the first article on the same day, as written by Mr. Jeffrey Tan, and entitled, Why Charities May Have to Give Horses in the Mouth. This was a commentary on the difficulties of conducting due diligence on donors. I'd like to thank all the three writers for their insights, their valuable suggestions, and sharing that article with us. Now, we do understand that charities require support to build up their capabilities and internal controls to protect themselves against money laundering and terrorist financing abuse. I'm happy to share that there are already existing resources for our charities to tap on. I'll just mention two or three of them. In 2015, the COC's office had issued a guideline called Protecting Your Charity Against Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing to illustrate how charities may be abused, and the guideline and the guidance also provides practical advice on how charities can identify and mitigate the risk of money laundering and terrorist financing abuse. Now, we have taken a look at the guideline that was published in 2015. We will be updating this document, but a lot of it is still very much relevant today. Please go and take a look at it. Now, we also had launched the Terrorist Financing Risk Mitigation Toolkit for charities earlier this year in February 2023. Now, this includes a step-by-step framework and a checklist to guide our charities in identifying and assessing the risk of terrorist financing abuse. And these also include recommended best practices to help charities mitigate the identified risks. The advice in this toolkit applies very much to money laundering as well. Just switch the name terrorist financing to money laundering. And a lot of the advice is given there, and the step-by-step guidance applies to money laundering as well. You will be able to find both documents in the charity portal under the section called Resources and Training, or via the QR code that we will share at the end of this webinar. We'll put it up, you can scan it, or go to the charity portal, you'll find it there. Now, with the Charities Capability Fund, or CCF, charities can engage external consultants to review and strengthen your key governance and management controls. We hope that you will take advantage of this opportunity and tap on the CCF, Charities Capability Fund, so that you can build up your capabilities to enhance your internal controls to mitigate the risk of money laundering and terrorist finance abuse. There are funds available, tap on it, and the people there will also be able to help you to do so. My office will continue to help the charities in your journey by providing the relevant support and resources. Many charities have yet to put in place the AML and CFT policies and procedures. We hope you'll do that soon. We will work on a template to help you in formulating your own AML and CFT policies and procedures. The template will be shared with the charities in due course. There are others who have done so, like PAA and the Red Cross. You should take a look at theirs. And when you do emulate theirs, of course, adjust it to what your own charity needs. It's always easier to have a template and that you can work on than to have to create one yourself. Now, lastly, you and I know that laws and regulations alone are but a blunt instrument. To successfully mitigate the risk of abuse against our charities need to be able to do its part by remaining vigilant against the vulnerabilities and to take active ownership in implementing the appropriate AML or CFT measures. We need both a robust regulatory regime as well as a sector that has effective AML and CFT safeguards. By working together, we can take proactive steps to make sure that our charity sector remains safe and our beneficiaries can continue to benefit from the donors who have put their public trust in us. Thank you very much, everyone. I wish you a good afternoon. The panel will be a very interesting one, and the presentation by the police and Danny will, of course, be very enlightening as well. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you, Commissioner of Charities. Very enlightening. Thank you. Great pleasure to introduce a good friend, Mr. Danny Ong. Now, Danny brings a wealth of experience in law, commercial acumen, and strategic wisdom. He is particularly known for his expertise in international fraud and financial crime, and is recognized amongst the global elite as one of the 40 global thought leaders in fraud and asset recovery field. Now, recently, he has pioneered fraud and asset recovery in the digital asset space, and having led as a counsel in landmark judgments from the Singapore court. So over to you, old friend, Danny.
Thank you, Regana, and thank you to the SPF for the wonderful presentation. I think you've heard a lot from the SPF about the regulatory framework, what is required in terms of reporting obligations and STRs. So I won't cover that ground. The section which I will cover is knowing your legal rights, as I said, a large part of which is already covered by the SPF. But I'd like to focus our time, and we have received a lot of questions from the audience, and thank you for that, on what to do exactly. It's well and good to know about the regulation, but what do I take away from that? What are the practical measures? So let me first turn to practical takeaways for your operations as a charity. And I'll just be focusing on my slide at page 44. Let's give it a moment for it to pop up. And at 44, first, let me just run through in addition to what my friends at the SPF, Shouting and Jun Young has done, as to what are some red flags, right? You have seen on the slides and on your screens a whole long list of red flags. But to me, one of the most obvious ones that will come to mind, and in terms of priorities or commonality in terms of how frequent they will come up, is firstly mismatch. Is there a mismatch between a donor's name and the payer's name? Simple, right? Example, has a donation been made in the name of Miss X, but the payment came from a corporate bank account in the name of ABC Company Limited from the BVI? Should questions be asked in those instances of a mismatch? And we say yes. Another red flag, a funky term. I mean, I only know of Smurfs from the cartoon days, where I'm showing my age. But smurfing, what exactly is smurfing? Has a large donation been broken down into small little chunks and small little bits and pieces, and a variety coming in? You have $1 million, and then $10 and $50 and $500,000. I think that deserves attention. Second red flag. A third red flag would be unrelated payouts. Somewhat related to the mismatch point is, has payment come in from an individual with no apparent relation to the declared donor, not a family member, not a company owned by the donor, but somebody who appears to be totally unrelated? Should questions be asked? Perhaps. And lastly, of the key common red flags, I would say large sums of cash in the bag, perhaps. But also, in addition to that, if the nature of the donation is odd, and we will speak a bit about that in our panel session, if a donor typically donates in cash, right, or doesn't donate at all and has no record, doesn't feature in your system, but suddenly comes and offers a pink diamond. Wow. $100 million worth of pink diamond, do you take that? I think that's a red flag by virtue of its rarity and the fact that people don't generally donate pink diamonds. Or cryptocurrencies, we will talk a bit about that. How about 10 Hermes bags, right? And bear bricks. And you would have, perhaps for those of you who have been exposed to the money laundering news of late, you would understand that a few of these items are actually were actually featured in the police seizures of the suspected money launderers. And the key common denominator amongst all these items is the ability to move and transport these items easily. So for the same reasons, they would, in my mind, raise red flags, and I would invite you to bear that in mind. Now, so what if there are red flags? What do I do, right? What can you do? And the first, we say, stating the obvious, and I do apologize for that, verifying the source of the funds. You are entitled to ask for verification. Secondly, open source searches, just going on the internet, Googling up or searching on a search engine the name of the donor, the name of related parties, or the company from which the monies are coming in from. You will be surprised what you can find from the internet. For example, if there were indeed some suspicious entities or companies or individuals, they might have surfaced in what is known as the Panama Papers, where offshore parties using offshore structures were reviewed publicly by certain journalists. Third, verifies the source of wealth. And when we say source of wealth, obviously, you're not going to ask a donor, where does your money come from if he's a rich individual or appears to be a rich individual. It's all very sensitive, and it might be even offensive to some. But one simple thing is to try to suss out whether there's a mismatch. Does the individual look like the type of person who's capable of giving $1 million, or who would be typically giving that? Does the person who donates a cryptocurrency look like a person who actually dabbles in cryptocurrency? I must apologize because that suggests that there's a certain amount of profiling. But here we're talking about potential criminal sanctions if we don't do our job properly. So we do need to ask. And lastly, of course, when there's suspicion or whenever there's in doubt, and I do apologize to the STR office, please do file an STR. One of the common features of the STR, and I'm not sure whether you picked that up from the earlier presentations by the SPF, is that there is an exclusion in terms of a limitation of your risk or your liability if you do file an STR, is in fact provided for in the statute, in the legal framework, that if you do file an STR, then you are taken not to have had knowledge of the criminal wrong and been in possession of that information at any time. So the police takes the regulatory framework, and the law here takes a report or be liable approach, and it provides statutory protection to you that files an STR. The other aspect is that it also protects you from claims for losses or claims for breach of confidentiality, for example. So a common example is when a bank files an STR, then the bank can't be taken to have a breach confidentiality or bank secrecy because it is simply complying with a legal obligation. And likewise, the law actually provides that a person who files an STR shall not be liable for any loss arising from the disclosure of information. So that much for your statutory protection. Let me then just move on to a flow chart, right? It depicts what you should do if you are involved in an investigation, as well as when might you be liable and to whom. So I'm moving on, apart from your entitlement and right to file an STR or to take protective measures and raise inquiries, verify, so on and so forth. I just wanted you to walk through with you a roadmap as to what may happen in real terms. So I'm at page 50, where assuming monies are received are later found to be proceeds of crime. So let me walk you through from the left to the right, right? Firstly, what were the circumstances when monies were received? Was it in a situation where you had no knowledge or reason to suspect that the monies or assets that you were receiving were proceeds of crime or tainted by crime? And so from that, if you had no such knowledge, if the monies had not yet been utilized, and it turns out that they were indeed proceeds of crime, of course, the police may still seize the monies. But that's not it. At the end of the day, there is still an ability and an option to lay claim to the monies as against a victim who may lay claim to the monies. The second scenario is that if monies had already been utilized, and if they've already been utilized and you had no knowledge or reason to suspect to begin with at the time of receipt and at the time of disbursement, then you have no liability to return. What is the alternative scenario when you do receive, or your organization receives the money, and someone within that organization dealing with the assets or monies had knowledge or reason to suspect that they were proceeds of crime or they were tainted? Again, if you had lodged an STR, then practically what you do is that you ring fence the monies, and eventually, depending on the direction of the authorities, you might need to surrender the monies or the assets to the authorities or the victim eventually. And in the alternative scenario where no STR is lodged, even though one has knowledge or reason to suspect, then there is, as flagged earlier by the SPF, potential criminal liability under local laws. There is, of course, the added element that you might also be, or the organization that's facilitating the laundering of the monies might have be exposed to civil liability to victims who had, for example, been defrauded. So that much for practical measures. I'm moving on to donations by your charity. So far, we've been talking about monies coming into your organization. How about monies going out to your organization? As earlier, the SPF team had very kindly flagged, you might yourself be used as a conduit or an intermediary, a vehicle to transport illicit proceeds or illegal proceeds of crime from one destination to another destination. So you are acting as an intermediary. So there are third-party risks involved there. As a charity, it might take the form for onward donations to third parties, your dealings with partner agencies. And on that note, practically speaking, it is quite simple. You need to understand your partners. Who are they? What's their profile? What checks and balances do they have in terms of assessment as to risk? Do they, as the SPF highlighted, operate in high-risk regions where you have lax laws, or there are conflict regions or jurisdictions? Those are questions that you should be asking in relations to third parties with whom you deal downstream. So thanks, Regana. That's as much as I have for now. We're moving on soon to the panel discussion, where I think it's going to be much more exciting than my presentation. Thank you.
You're most welcome. Be ready. Yep. Well, thank you, Danny. So please keep your questions coming. I mean, there's lots and lots of questions. And if there's a specific one that you really want answered for your charity, please vote them up. So joining Danny today, we have Mr. Benjamin William. Benjamin now is a familiar face to many, is the Chief Executive and Secretary General of the Singapore Red Cross, SRC. He oversees all the humanitarian work of the SRC, both locally and overseas, and have been part of the transformation and growth of SRC. As he was told, he was parachuted in. Under this leadership, SRC has expanded its suite of humanitarian services to serve the vulnerable in Singapore and beyond, particularly the elderly. SRC's efforts have been widely recognized and is also seen as a thought leader in the field of humanitarian work. And next to Ben, which I'm going to call Ben, if you don't mind if I call you Ben.
Please.
We have Mr. Dennis Lim. Now, Dennis is a partner of RSM Singapore and the head of the firm's business consulting practice. He has over 22 years of experience, actively volunteers his skill sets in finance and accounting for several social enterprises. He's involved in providing internal controls and risk management solutions for the non-profit sector, serving charities of all sizes. Now, Dennis also sits on a few boards of charities. So today's topic is of paramount importance, especially in recent times. We will be using case scenarios to help you, our audience, to sort of understand the different situations, but at the same time, we will get to your questions. And I'm sure we will also be answering a lot of your questions through the case scenarios. Please note, all the case scenarios are fictional. Gentlemen, shall we start? Danny is laughing. It is fictional because I made it up. Okay, so let's deep dive into the first case scenario. Okay, so we have the first case scenario. I'll read it very quickly. The Lims are owners of a very lucrative online art platform known for their high-profile charity donations. They have established a reputation as a philanthropic art patrons, contributing generously to various charities and cultural institutions. Now, over the years, they've only been donating in cash to Charity A and Charity B. Now, recently, these two charities have noted particular or peculiar patterns in their donations, such as a donation of asset, which could be a property. And I don't know whether they were giving pink diamonds, but I know they were giving properties, raising some concerns in the members of the board of both charities. Now, both charities not sure what to do. And I know you said that I took down a note here that Danny said that you must ask that question, where did it come from? But it's very difficult for a charity to ask the donor, where did it come from? So let's look at this case scenario. So I want to start with Ben, because you're from SRC. Any red flags here?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I think it's very important to understand that for most charities, we are always desperate for donations. And when we have a donor who is very generous, we tend to accept it as a gift. In this scenario, I think some of the points that Danny made just now is important. The donation of assets is not uncommon, right? But you need to look out for mismatch. Now, the limbs are obviously into the art business. And for example, if they donated an art piece, you would not be as suspicious if they donated an asset of another nature. But also often donors may donate assets based on the event that the charity is running. So for example, if we are running a gala dinner and we need items for auction, and if a donor donates a diamond, it's not necessarily a red flag. But I agree with Danny that actually we have a right to ask some questions, especially concerning assets. So if we often have jewelry stores and donating diamonds or jewelry for our auction items at gala dinner or charity golf. So I think these are more acceptable because you can expect it coming from an organization like that. I think the bottom line is it is important for charities to build a relationship with the donor as much as they build a relationship with their beneficiaries. Often, I think charities may miss out on this aspect of building relationships with donors. So I would expect that in this scenario, actually the charity will have a very good relationship with the limbs and would be able to have a good conversation with them as to why they are shifting to assets. Okay, so that's one. The second is, I think it is important for charities to do due diligence. And of course, at least as a first step, there are many checks that you can do as to why these assets are coming to you. You check on the limbs in the internet can of course turn up a wealth of information. And then there are second level checks like MAS checks and things like that. So I think it is important. The bottom line is charities still need to do due diligence.
Okay, so charities need to do due diligence regardless of the donation.
Okay, so I will say we need to be practical, right? So a charity like the Singapore Red Cross receives thousands of donations, right? And every donation is not an item that is suspicious. Here we are talking about the scenario where a person who donates in cash suddenly starts donating in assets. So it, raises eyebrows, it raises your antenna. Now it could be another kind of suspicious transaction, like suddenly a big amount of money in cash. Maybe later we can talk about that. But if a charity like Singapore Red Cross did checks on every donation, then we'll be doing nothing but checks, and we'll probably have to have a manpower pool of about 100 people doing checks.
Yeah, I think that's another question we will ask a little bit later. How about you, Dennis? Anything to add? Any red flags that you see here?
Well, actually, I completely agree with what Ben has said, Regana. I think you have to really make the assessment and look at the patterns. Your scenario actually talk about the limbs being philanthropic art collectors. So I would imagine that if they have a regular pattern of donating every year, and suddenly they have a very expensive art piece, or perhaps collection, or perhaps even a museum somewhere in Europe that they want to give to which would be windfall. Would that then be considered to be in line with the pattern of what they do, right? I think charity need to be practical also. Okay, you need to look at setting a certain threshold or bar, right? You cannot be looking at small donations and saying, okay, there's an AML risk here, there's an AML, because I think using logic and common sense, how is this going to actually perpetuate a AML transaction, right? So you here have a threshold. Look at, you know, the kind of assets, right? Maybe a certain policy on that, right? How big, what type of assets they are, right? If someone comes to you with a Van Gogh, it's easy to trace whether the Van Gogh is you know, there's something wrong with the Van Gogh, right? Or it could even be a counterfeit, right? So I think certain things you would have to do, and it's just about applying, you know, common sense thinking and approach towards that. Now, having said that, just to let a little bit of spice to your question, right? The limbs may be philanthropic in nature, right? In practice, but are they actually in any way able to influence the board? That's also something which you need to ask, because there are also donors that actually have a good amount of interaction and potentially, you know, are serving on boards, or perhaps even, you know, able to influence. So these are things which we should also think about, right? In terms of when big assets or big funds are coming in, right? What are they actually going to be used for?
Okay,
I
so
pause there, yeah.
it falls on the charity to do the due diligence. So we have a question here. What would the ideal amount be to do all these checks? Like, you know, you say SRC is constantly having donations coming in, and you can't check everyone. There are charities who are so lean. And someone said, this is not a core business, just doing checking. So is there a threshold? And any of you?
I think that Ben made two good points, right? Excellent points. One is have a policy which adopts a threshold, guidelines, parameters for that. And I think one has to sit down and formulate that. The other one is really, it's common sense. I mean, $50 is different from $500,000. 500 is very different from $50 million. So are we going to do checks on $50? That seems quite far-fetched. But 500,000, 550 million, 5 million, of course, we will have to, right? But I think taking Ben's term, adding spice, right? And common sense. Questions might be asked. Well, consistent donor, philanthropic art patrons, but is there public news on a family dispute? Is there public news on a shareholder fight? Is there public news that one of them actually just became a bankrupt? Or the business which they operated actually has collapsed or is under some kind of embroiled in a big shareholder tussle or legal lawsuit, and out pops 10 million into your charity they put on the table. So again, as I said, I mean, it's taking Ben's point, common sense and open source checks.
Okay. This question is actually for Danny because it was based on your presentation, the difference between smurfing and layering. I think it's good to make it a little bit more clear so that they sort of understand.
No, smurfing is just simply the ability to actually mix up, right, the chunks and the sizes and the quantity. It basically breaks down the total value into different chunks. And not consistent chunks, so that it becomes, in colloquial terms, more rojak. And the more rojak it is, then the harder it is for you to pick up, or the less suspicious it is for you. But ironically, because it's rojak, you should be it flags inconsistency, right? Inconsistency, which then raises red flags.
Yes, Ben.
Yeah, can I add something? I think what the point that was raised is, when we talk about these donations and the limbs are regular donors, and I think this very real scenario, do they have influence on the board? Which would be the reason why then they would have this donation, because they want to influence some sort of action, right? And I think when I talk about due diligence, I think sometimes you jump into money laundering and terrorist funding and then just focus on that. But it is important for charities to have good overall financial governance, a regular change of the finance committee members, so that you don't have a finance committee member who is influenced by a donor. So because there's constant change, you have a separation between those involved in the operations and those involved in the oversight. so that the oversight people can't influence the operational people too much and vice versa. So I think the overall financial governance is important, so that then you can, the due diligence becomes a subset of the overall financial governance. And I think that is an important point for charities. To jump into trying to have a good AML and FT system without having an overall good financial governance system, I think is a bit faulty.
Okay, so I have a very interesting question here, which I think I need to ask you, because I'm still wondering if people still actually do give checks. If an individual walks into our office and makes a big cash donation via a check, how does a charity perform a check on that check? Sorry, not
Okay.
yeah.
So for Singapore Red Cross, we have a different policy concerning cash. So we have a threshold at which we will accept cash donations. In fact, beyond a certain threshold, we will not accept cash donation.
Okay.
No matter how big it is.
And cash checks as well.
Okay, and cash checks. Now, checks is slightly different because checks will have to be cleared by the banking system. So we still have time to do some checks on the donor, right? Because especially when you give a check, even if it's a cash check, it has your name on it. And we can do some checks. But we are very cautious on check donations and cash donations.
Okay, how about online donations? Dennis is smiling, so I need to ask him this one.
No, I was just a thought just crept through my mind whether or not you're worried about whether the check is counterfeit.
No, yeah, that's why we never issue a receipt until the check is cleared. We never issue the IRAS receipt until we will do an acknowledgement that we have received the check, but we will only issue the receipt after the check is cleared.
True.
That's important. But I think the other point that I think Commissioner made as well is important is whether or not you are actually a tool of money laundering. You may receive the receipts of money laundering, which is what we are dealing with, but whether you're a tool. And so we have very strict policy concerning refunding donations, number one. And number two, we are very strict on rejecting directed donation. So we will not accept a donor coming to us and say, you need to go to this vendor to buy, or you need to give to this organization.
Yep.
So we are very strict on that.
Yeah, which is actually got to, at this point, we need to also reinforce the definitions, because sometimes I think a lot of members are not clear. When you say AML is basically taking dirty money and making it clean, right? Whereas FT, terrorist financing, TF, sorry, is about taking clean money and channeling it towards things that are, not good. Right. So that is actually the logic behind actually a lot of the decision making and an analysis, right? That is at a due diligence point of view. So you should be applying that thinking, right, in terms of questioning, okay, if this is coming to us, before even taking the money, right? If this is coming to us, what is the purpose? Why would this person want to have a specific instruction or specific request for this? Just back to your point on the checks before I sort of missed that out. Of course, one of the things that earlier on Danny mentioned is the mismatch. So if you got Mr. A and then the check is coming from Mr. B, then that's wrong already. Or Mr. A and the check is coming from a company, and then you have to start to ask yourself the question, why is such an arrangement being presented to you? And is it logical? Right, when you know that this person never really does that. The other point, of course, is if someone comes to you 50,000 in cash in a bag, right? That is something that is, of course, immediate red flag, right? Which I think, to Ben's point, is probably not just about the fact that cash is heavier to carry, It's also about the issue. Yeah, it's also about the issue, because some board members actually asked me that. It's about the issue of the fact that once, assuming it's good, assuming the money is clean and it's good, but the problem is that it also raises issues when it comes to handling it in the operations. When your people had start to have to count and get that machine and count the 50 million in cash, that raises a lot of concerns also. There become operational issues, delays, and obviously a risk of fraud as well, right? And so that's another consideration.
And the reality, Dennis, is that today you can't even bank that in. You can't bank that bag
Yes,
of cash
yeah.
in today's environment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Agree.
So talking about banking, we have someone else before we move on to the next question, but I think this is quite pertinent. A lot of people donate via PayNow online.
Mm.
And then sometimes they don't furnish their full name, and it may not be furnished in the bank statement. So how do you, any tools or tips to track donations that come through online that they should keep an eye out for?
Okay, I had some experience with this. I wouldn't say a lot, but I think it's not just about your charity having a website that allows, or encourages online. It's also about, all the platforms that we have today. So you have the, Giving SG and all the other various types of good platforms that are doing great things, by the way, for individuals as well as for corporates or for charities that need help. Right. I think at that level, at the platform level, I'm just assuming that there are a lot of due diligence that's already done, screening that's already done to make sure that the person that's asking for donation is a bona fide person. The platform itself is sound, right? And the recipients and how the money is channeled through to what programs are already tested, and we know what it lies behind. So I think those parts are good. So if you were to do giving through that, right? Then of course there's another layer of defense, right? In that that platform will make sure that you're authentically what you're giving is going to go to the right cause, right? And that cause is set up for a good cause. Okay. The other part is, so that's one aspect. The other aspect is, of course, your own organization when you do the QR codes and so on. So I think there should be certain minimum level of what information you are asking, right? You can't just say, okay, if out of 10 questions, 3 is answered, we just let the thing go through, right? So there has to be some sort of setup, right? And the setup must be done, with decent amount of questioning, right? To ensure that, the questions are asked and we are comfortable, right? And if the questions are not asked, then it would trigger certain other things, right? So that would be then the level 2. So level 1s would be the 80 to 90% who are happy to give all the information that you ask for, and they have no qualms about it. They're not holding anything back. The level 2s are the ones which maybe have got 1 or 2 questions or 2 or 3 questions that are perhaps sensitive questions that we then need to then stop the transaction and say, hey, we'll come back to you, right? We'll have a clarification, because it is our responsibility to do that before we let the money in.
I think the important point to emphasize on that is that it's a question of acting reasonably.
Yeah.
So as a charity organization, acting reasonably in asking the right questions, collating that information. And that's as far as it goes. I think it's quite different, and I don't think one should confuse yourself with, being under an obligation to prevent, that wrong. I mean, what if you have 10 people who's donating 1 million, so giving it online, assuming that can be done, each of them from certain bank accounts which check out, but actually they're all fraudsters, and whatever information that they give you online is all fake anyway, right? But I mean, there are limitations to what a charity or any organization or bank can do, even, let alone a charity organization. So I think it's important to remember, I mean, after hearing this for an hour or so, it's not as if the whole burden is upon the charity organization, and that's not, I think, what is being suggested.
Yeah. So I totally agree. I mean, it's really unrealistic for charities to bear the full responsibility of it. And that's why I use the word due diligence. I mean, you do due diligence, and then after that, you have to let it take its course.
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to wrap this up. Just want each of our panelists to just give one key takeaway. If there's any charities who are facing this issue right now, that they have a donor who has suddenly changed their donation pattern, what would one key takeaway that they should think about if something like this happens to them? Ben, I start with you first.
Okay, so I come back to this issue of relationships and due diligence. Especially if it's a regular donor, then it's incumbent on charities to build up good relationship with their donors. And if you have that good relationship, then you are in a much better position to be able to discuss with the donor if his giving pattern changes. So build up a good relationship, especially with your key donors.
Thank you. Dennis.
In relation to this question, I suppose it is know your donor, you have to really know your donor. And I don't think it's just a paper exercise to know your donor, right? Some of the boards that I actually have dealt with, they really know their donors. They know where, where the family has been, where the source of wealth is, whether there's any thefts in the family, etc., and what they're trying to achieve. So that really demonstrates to me that it goes beyond, just a superficial level. And then you can then start to peel the onion and wonder whether or not, is this a problem transaction or not, right?
For myself, I think 3 simple suggestions or tips: who, what, where. Who being the point that Dennis raised, who's the donor, knowing your donor. What is the nature of the asset? Where does it come from? I think if you keep those 3 questions in mind in relation to any significant donations, then I think that should allow you to at least have questions come up to mind. Thank you.
Thank you. And I totally agree with knowing your donor. And I think working together with your donors, knowing them gets you more donations for charity. So knowing a donor, not the superficial level, I think it's very, very important. So now let's go on to case scenario 2. And I think we're going to be answering a lot of questions on this. Charity C is a modest or small nonprofit organization in Singapore. Recently was very surprised and super grateful, as they are, when they receive a substantial donation from an anonymous benefactor who insists on only donating in the form of cryptocurrency and does not wish for a tax deduction receipt. Could be a dream donor for many. The charity, with the limited resources and expertise, appreciates the generosity, but with a sudden donation of digital assets raises concern within the management and operations because they're not sure what to do with this. So firstly, I'm not going to ask you for any red flags, but I'm actually going to go and ask for Ben first, because Ben, SRC does allow for cryptocurrency donation. So could you share a little bit more about this and the process that you have put in place, and maybe some advice for our charities who are looking at going towards that direction?
Okay. So first of all, I will say that charities going into cryptocurrency donation or accepting cryptocurrency donation should do so cautiously, because these forms of donations are some of the most difficult to track and often controversial and invite other attention. So we are actually just taking baby steps. To say that we accept cryptocurrency in that fashion may send the wrong signal. So we are only accepting cryptocurrency through one particular agency. And this particular agency has been licensed by MAS to accept cryptocurrency and deal in cryptocurrency, number 1. Number 2, we have worked with them that they will do all the AML checks on all their clients who are going to donate to Red Cross through cryptocurrency. And these AML checks will be done on any donations more than $1,000. I mean, you can set a different threshold, but we set the threshold $1,000, which is pretty low. So and then the last point is that we don't receive the cryptocurrency. The agency that is accepting the cryptocurrency donation on our behalf will convert it to fiat and then give it to us. So we are not going to carry cryptocurrency. So this is what we have adopted. I'm not sure what other charities will adopt, but we are only embarking on it in a very cautious manner. Yeah.
Thank you, Ben. So Danny, I'm going to ask you, what kind of challenges or risks that the charity may face in managing such cryptocurrency donations?
Let me just start off and pick what was said earlier, pick up from what was said earlier. I think there are a good number of crypto payment service platforms that are licensed by the MAS that, as was mentioned, can have the ability to open an account for you, as well as to convert that into fiat for you. Now, in my experience, I mean, we do a lot of fraud and financial crime relating to cryptocurrency and other digital assets. One of the things to look out for if you are receiving cryptocurrency is is it mainstream cryptocurrency? Is the digital asset a mainstream asset? When I say mainstream, if we're talking about USDC, USDT, BTC, ETH, I think all that is mainstream, right? But there are certain types of crypto which are actually well known to have been used by criminal syndicates for laundering. Monero, for example, where it's difficult to trace. I say that because, and you can actually just Google it up and just check. I mean, there are yearly reports by specialists, for example, Chainlysys, Elliptic, and so on and so forth, that actually identify which are the ones that has the largest propensity for abuse by criminal syndicates. So that's the first point: mainstream crypto or non-mainstream crypto. Secondly, I think the cryptocurrency does have benefits in the sense that it is always traceable, right? As to where it's coming from. Of course, depending on how enthusiastic or knowledgeable you are about the tech, that sector, you actually have the ability to trace backwards as to its source. And therefore, in that sense, it's even better than receiving cash. But I take the point earlier mentioned that there is a good number. Crypto is still, despite its traceability, liable to be abused by criminal syndicates, ironically. But there are a good number of what we would call new money and new billionaires out there who've made a lot of money properly from their ventures in the digital asset space, and who are very happy, instead of buying a Bugatti or many Rolls Royces or pink diamonds, to actually donate to charity. So I think, I would invite you to be open-minded about it, but with the caution added on that was mentioned earlier by Ben.
Thank you. Dennis.
Okay, on maybe I deal first with the issue of a small charity and a complex form of asset. So I think normally, and this is not, again, to scare all the small charities to say, hey, you must be very wary about, people who are giving you a sudden windfall large amounts. But usually there would be, again, it's a patterning, right? So if you're a small charity, chances are, you will get the regular funding, and the funding size, may not be the sort of extremely large trenches or sort of influx of funds. So maybe the funding model may be a little bit different as well. So I think that would be itself something to be concerned about. So if the ops people are looking at it, would this actually be a red flag to them, right? Secondly, as a small charity, right, do you have the sort of resources at hand, right, to manage this, right? Of course, large charities like Red Cross and so on and so forth, they're able to have access to the talent in the market, but some of the smaller ones realistically may not, right? So issues like do you use an agent to handle these things? What is the security around it? I know it's based on a blockchain, but at the end of the day, also I think Danny mentioned about the issue of the integrity of the crypto, right? There's also been a few cases over the last 3 years of crypto fraud, right? Or essentially digital currencies being taken away, right? So this is also another consideration, whether or not the charity has the ability to really deal with such things, right? And of course, the third thing, which is also on a number of people's mind, not just crypto but NFTs as well, is valuation, right? So right, I mean, and the market would have to speak on what they value it to be, right, last year versus this year, for instance, right? So the question is, it then boils down to what is the objective of the fundraising for the charity or the donations for the charity. Are we using this to build a long term, right? Are we structuring such that there's a balance, right, between some which is a more newer sort of thinking and approach towards taking on donations, or are we just specifically targeting a very immediate need that we have, right? So these are the things which I think board must and also the committees must come to terms with, right? Like what do you accept, and on what grounds do you accept? Do you need this kind of donations, and how will you then deal with it?
So I have an interesting question. A lot of people are setting up home offices in Singapore.
Okay.
Any concerns there with donation coming in from home offices? So Dennis.
Family offices.
Family offices, sorry. Home,
home
family
offices
offices.
Okay. Donations from family offices. Okay. But the family office is actually set up as an extension of the family to contain, right, the family's wealth and to make sure that they invest in certain ways. Yeah, of course. I think certain family offices are guided. They have a certain objective, right? They not only want to make sure that they preserve the wealth, they also want to make sure that they do good, right? So in the aspect of doing good, right, perhaps some of the mandates from the family office team that manages the money would be, to put certain donations, right, to organizations that have good causes, right, and they will do a screening and so on and so forth, right? So I think family officers themselves also they will be subjected to proper registration, proper the black and white is all there essentially, right? So I think whilst I believe also regulations are also tightening up on the family office side, right? I think that would obviously be good, because if you want it to be regulated, then they would MAS would also check, where the source of funds are, where the wealth is coming from, and then they would be comfortable, right, to give these particular entities the right to set up in Singapore. So I think that is a step moving in the right direction, and I think we should watch and see how that evolves. Certainly, I mean, I guess the amount of legislation and amount of checks will level up, both between the family officers and also the recipients of the family office money, whether it be the fund managers or in our case, right, the deserving charities. Yeah.
I would just add to what Dennis has said. I think the fact that it's a family office doesn't change the questions to be asked, right? But another dimension, another way to look at it is that if it's a family office, it's obviously a party that's an organization that's resident in Singapore. It has typically a group of staff, actual physical operations, all of which add to the impression of legitimacy and will assist you in your due diligence and your questioning of, who, what, where, right?
I actually have yes.
Just to add, I mean, we actually have the experience of receiving funds from family office. So I think I totally agree with Dennis and Danny, but I think the additional thing is that most of these family offices are set up by prominent people who have made their fortune. You can do a lot of checks on their legitimacy. I mean, over and above the fact that they've been registered by MAS and that they've been given the status of family office. So I think even a cursory check in the internet and all that can turn out a lot of information. Secondly, many of them actually want to build a relationship with the organization. It's more than being just a donor. So I think it's important to do that. Thanks.
Thank you. I actually have a question for Danny that came through. Is that time frame for the SDR to be made when a donation comes in? Is there should they do it immediately, or do they do all their checks and then do the reporting?
I think it's sequential, right? When the asset or the money comes in, and when you have enough information that will give you a cause for suspicion, then you lodge the SDR. Yeah.
Okay.
So there's no mandated time frame. Again, I think back to Dennis's point, it's a question of doing due diligence, collating information, and then having the sense, applying common sense to say, okay, I think this is tricky. Let's just lodge the SDR.
Okay, thank you very much. So just to round off this case scenario, key takeaways and any tips. So I'm going to start with Dennis first.
I guess there's a saying, right? If it's too good to be true, probably isn't. So yeah, that would be my takeaway.
Okay, if it's too good to be true, always check.
Yeah.
Ben.
So I think my takeaway is that I think charities have no choice but to consider cryptocurrency donations, because otherwise you'll be, you have to move with the times, but you have to exercise caution, work, and this is especially so with small charities, because you don't have the in-house resources. Even Red Cross doesn't have that. So you have to work with platforms or agencies that is properly licensed, properly directed, and to work with them in order to benefit from these cryptocurrency donations. One last point is that most charities are conservative in their investment policies. So like Red Cross, we are very conservative, which is why we decided that we won't keep the donation in crypto. but immediately convert it to faith. So some charities may be a bit more aggressive and may want to keep it in crypto, but I think most charities are quite conservative. Yeah, thank you.
On my part, actually, I think, you know, it's actually an asset class that, you know, one should keep an open mind about. As I said earlier, as was mentioned by Ben, there are platforms out there that can help you do the diligence, convert it into fiat. We're not suggesting that you hold or receive the cryptocurrency. We're just in the context of receiving donations by way of Bitcoin, for example, which a licensed agent by MAS would convert for you into US. Why not tap into that market? And I think that's as Ben said, moving with the times, and I don't see anything wrong with that. Yeah.
Thank you. So small steps, I guess, when approaching to taking in donations via crypto. So our last case scenario, because we have many questions coming in, but let's look at this one. A multinational corporation, Wingspan, has been donating regularly, and the charity has been allocating all the incoming donations to various outreach programs and disbursements as charities do. Recently, and very unfortunately, the chairman has been called up in relation to money laundering activities. Now, of course, it triggers many concerns about the legitimacy of the past donations. Charity is not sure what to do. Should they ring fence? Should they refund? And they're now faced with a dilemma, right? So many questions. Keep it, return it, report it. So I'm going to ask Dennis first. Your thoughts on this?
Okay. I think we're talking about a multinational. So really with multinationals, we didn't define whether the multinational is privately owned or is it a part of a listed group and so on, on whichever stock exchange. But I think they would first of all have to have certain position on why they do certain things or why they have certain social or community contributions, right? I think these are all declared or disclosed. So as part of the normal checks that you do, you just sort of have to add 2 and 2 together, right? Is what this person is doing, right? Is that in line with what he's representing for the group, and is that the purpose of what the group is giving all these funds for? So the logic test has to come in. The second thing is, of course, if you look at overseas operations, and this has been a question asked to me before. When you get suddenly a sum of money coming from overseas, or a group, or maybe a connected entity to that group that is new, you don't know about, right? How much checks do you need to do? And again, boils down to, you know, that sort of competency and the experience that the charity staff have, right? Some people will, I think if you talk to the banking community, you know that if there are the large overseas corporations that are incorporated or registered, the headquarters are registered in certain domains and certain jurisdictions, you can't get information out, like, you know, Cayman, BVI, and so on. You know, of course, there are different ways of getting around that as well. But there is also that corporate veil that, you know, you have to overcome, right? And looking at it, you know, to what reasonable extent do we be saying that, okay, we have to check, or we just simply can't check here? Okay. The other aspect is also about, you know, when you get when you suddenly receive this news, right, that recently the chairman of the group has been called upon, right? So I think it was alluded to in the a bit of the presentation from the commissioner, right? Himself was saying, you know, look back at your transactions between 2019 and 20. So this is exactly the same sort of scenario, but not from a group, but also it's not exactly the same, but I think that approach would similarly apply. You have to actually sort of ascertain what the period is, and then go back, and hopefully you have the transactions there, because, you know, statutorily you need to keep copies of all this, right? And, you know, whether or not those transactions and the supporting behind those transactions, they are still intact, right? And did we ask the right questions, or were any of these funds, you know, potentially higher risk in nature, right, versus the normal kind of means in which these funds come in through this particular chairman, right? So that would be a few things.
Yes, Ben.
Okay, so I think based on the scenario, it's a multinational company. You assume that they are involved in legitimate business. Receiving a donation from them would be, would never raise a red flag,
Yes.
right? Now, the chairman is under investigation. I think as Dennis pointed out, you need to differentiate. Is the company the chairman? Is it or is the chairman being investigated separately? But I think in such a scenario, nevertheless, what charities should do is to go through their donations to see what is the record of the donations. Those donations that have already been used in the programs, you can list it and take note of it. Those that have not yet been used, to be on the safe side, it is good to ring fence it. Let the authorities know, and then wait for the guidance from the authorities as to whether the person is being charged, whether money is being recalled. And then, as Commissioner said, eventually the board will have to make a decision. Now, if the board decides that even if the authorities don't ask for the money to be refunded, but it is a reputational smear on the organization, then you may want to make a decision to refund it. But then the question comes, refund to who? So I think these are some of the issues. But I think the bottom line is you need to, in a scenario like this, know which are the donations that came from this entity, ring fence those money that has not yet been used, and then take guidance from the authorities.
Okay, Danny, legal risk for the charity. I think that's a very important question. So I'm going to ask, just like Dennis said, must make it a little bit spicy, right? What if the charity says, it's okay, I'm going to keep it. What are the dangers in the event? Because like Ben said, right? Is the chairman connected? Is it a separate matter? So if the charity says, okay, everyone, it's fine. It's okay.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. The reality is that at the point in time you've known and learned about the news of the chairman being, say, charged or being hauled up by the authorities for suspected money laundering, you presumably don't have enough information to decide whether the money that's in your hands that has not, that you've presumably temporarily ring-fenced is tainted or not. How are you going to trace that? Let's assume that the money came from Wingspan Group's subsidiary in Cayman Islands. That doesn't tell you one way or another whether it's tainted or not tainted, right? The reality is that you don't know. So I would say that, a few things that I would say, suggest that you consider. First, ask the questions of Wingspan or the relevant subsidiary that's donating, right? Where is this money from, and so on and so forth. What are the charges about? Let them get you comfortable, so to speak. Secondly, is there any difficulty with lodging a suspicious transaction report? And rather than asking the question, should you, maybe it's flip the other way around in these circumstances. Why shouldn't you lodge an STR, right? To protect yourself while you ring fence the monies. Now, after a while, it's a dynamic assessment as to whether you should continue to ring fence or you get comfortable enough to actually deploy the funds. That has to do with what are the authorities' reaction to the STR, what responses you get from the Wingspan representatives, and any other due diligence you can do in relation to the money laundering charges. For all you know, it's money laundering in relation to the chairman's own personal side business in running 100 Italian restaurants in America, and has nothing to do with Wingspan.
Yeah. Okay, I hope it's not the Olive Garden. So, but there are many small charities. Like Dennis, you pointed out, the charities have lean number of staff, right? And they don't have the resources to do in-depth checks and donations coming in. Like you were saying, operationally, sometimes when you get a big donation, how do they check? This may be the case. Any tips on how charities, smaller charities, can protect themselves as a matter of best practice? So, Dennis, I start with you first.
Okay, when you don't have the resources, I think it's always good to ask around, right? Outsourcing is one way, right? Some of these agencies are good at actually doing such checks, right? There are many out there, right? There are also many other platforms. There's also Factiva, World Check, which FIs commonly use, on Fido, and so on and so forth, right? So there are many other agents out there that can help, right? And for that very reason, I think the government authorities also rely a lot on the corporate services and the supporting cast, to flag out some of these potential risks early on, right? So I think that one aspect is that, but even when you outsource, I think for the smaller guys, they have to know also that ultimately it's still their responsibility. So it's about also getting some comfort that whatever I'm not too sure, I get somebody who's an expert to do it, but I also have to ask certain reasonable questions like what sort of databases are you using? Are you sure you'll be able to give me a comprehensive search? If something happens, what will you tell me, right? And will you tell me on time? And then will you then effect a stop to the transaction, or how will you advise me? So beyond just signing the contract and allocating it to somebody, a service provider, we also have to ask as small charities, what are the things that we should expect, right, from this service arrangement.
Ben.
Yeah, so I think especially if you're talking about small charities, what can you do? I think there's a lot of resources online. So I think so first of all, you cannot check every donation that comes in. So I think it is important that charities have guidelines on what is the threshold where they limits that they set, and then abide by it. Then you have the fact that if most of your donations come through the bank accounts, so that's your first level, you are more confident, and be careful about receiving cash or donations that are not traceable. Second is the internet checks, right? Even on the internet, you can check on the status of individuals and your donors. Then you have the ACRA checks,
Yes.
right? Whether this person is actually registered properly. You also have the MAS list on the first schedules, yeah? For our enhanced due diligence, if we really are worried, especially for overseas donations, we also check the USA sanctions list, the UN sanctions list. So there's a lot of information online which you can go to before you even have to embark on like adopting an agency or hiring an agency, which can be quite expensive for small charities.
Danny?
Not much more to add to the wisdom that Ben and Dennis has shared, other than to emphasize actually something that Ben has said. Very simple, limit the sources. You have no resources, you're a small charity with limitations, then equally limit the resources and limit the chunks or the bite size that you will receive. And I think that significantly reduces the risk.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to keep time for our audience because quite a number of questions come in. So let's sort of summarize this one. Any key takeaways for a charity? Let's say, for example, they are facing the same problem as the case scenario. Anything they should do, at least the first step they should take. So Dennis, I'm going to start with you first.
I think they should have a pub test. When I say pub test, I mean, what would a reasonable person perceive if you did something like this, right? So if you didn't return the money and, somehow you went ahead and, commingle it with the rest of the fund and it got more complicated, became more rojak, right? As Danny said, then how would that look to the public, right? So certain considerations of that before you take actions.
Then
I think the reputational risk is sometimes as important as the legal risk and all that. So I think most charities will err on the part of caution and seek a way to refund the donation or seek the authorities' guidance on what the fund should where the funds should be refunded to.
Danny.
Take advantage on what's available on the internet. Like I said earlier, you'll be surprised by what you can find.
Thank you. So we're going to go to the questions sent by our audience, but I think there was some that was pre-sent, and there is one, and I'm going to open up for any of you to answer. There are some organizations doing good works in sanctioned countries, but not all are officially registered. Okay. And I'm assuming this is a donor who asked, if we support such organizations, what are the practical measures we can implement adequate AML and CFT risk, or practical measures of how they can stop AML through there? which is quite interesting.
This is a fascinating one. That's a very, very good question. I'll give it a go. I would be very concerned.
Yeah.
To establish the destination from a perspective of donor, right, Regana? So from a perspective of a donor, where the money is going, where is it, how is it being used, what kind of activities am I financing or funding? Purportedly to help children, purportedly to help a good cause, but how do we actually know? And unless you've actually visited, and even if you visited, what are you really seeing? Are you seeing something that's real, or are you seeing something that's been made up just for your visit? I have no answer in terms of providing a solution to it, other than to say that it's a red flag. And I think it's one thing, and also it depends on the type of sanctions. I think we must be sensitive to it. There are economic sanctions which are imposed that are driven by politics. There are sanctions which are imposed because of, let's say, war crimes or human rights issues, right? I think that we need to be sensitive to understand what type of sanctions it is, and to be able to then give a sense as to whether how much is there as to a risk of abuse, right? There are also ways practically to deal with that. For example, if you are actually funding and supporting an orphanage in a sanctioned country, are there other means by which you can support it directly? By, for example, if they needed 100 beds, to actually support that, right? If they needed construction for a particular hostel, to actually finance the development of the hostel directly. So that enables you, in a sense, to keep a tighter leash and understanding and ability to track where your money is going.
Thank you. Ben?
Yeah, so I agree that it's a very high risk proposition. So there are legal implications, as Danny has pointed out, and you have to be careful not to run foul of the legal implication. So, for example, if you're you're seeking to donate to a country which is a UN sanctions country, you have to make sure that you have the permission from the UN to provide that donation. There's some forms of donation that are accepted, humanitarian assistance. But if you are a single donor, independent donor, it's very difficult for you to get through that legal framework. So I think that's the first point. You make sure that you don't run foul of the legal implications. Secondly, from our experience, I think in countries, not only sanctioned countries, but even difficult to operate countries, it is always better to work, number one, with partners that you know intimately. Because even with partners that you know, you might find money being slipped away for terrorist funding without you knowing. Right? So I think it is very important. We often try to find partners who have a Singapore connection. Not that it is 100% foolproof, but at least we are able to further justify their credentials. The third thing is, I think it is good to do projects rather than send cash. I totally agree with Danny. We often do projects and we never give it in one lump sum. We see the project coming up, then the second tranche, the third tranche. So to make sure that the slippage of funds is minimized. So I think these are some things that we do to minimize the slippage. But if you are an individual donor, it's very difficult to do this. So it's good to work with an established organization.
Thank you, Ben. Dennis, anything to add?
No, I think it's about a risk-based approach. If you are going to go and support an organization that is operating in a hot zone, then there are risks. You must be aware of it. So you must also understand what are the treatment causes or the risks. Are you going to totally say, oh, no more already, we cut it off? Or we say, okay, let's revisit and relook at it and what we can potentially do to maybe strengthen the level of governance that we try to try to sort of impose on this relationship lah, right? Of course, them being unlicensed, I don't think the licensing is going to change overnight, right?
Yeah.
Right? Because these are sometimes there are countries, really strive, right? It's not going to change overnight. So other things that you can do to give yourself comfort. Who are their partners? Who do they work with? Who is funding them also besides you? You can't just be the only guy there who is, trying to, help with hunger situation in that country, right? So, who are their partners? Have they got track record? Is it proven? Maybe understand why they didn't get licensed, right? Short of going down to the ground, like Danny said, kick the tires, you may not work, right? But ultimately, I think it's going in with your eyes open, knowing that there is a risk profile associated with this particular decision, right? And not that we want to turn a blind eye, but we just have to do our very, what is reasonable, practicable, right? To give the stakeholders of our charity, right, and our boards and our members, more comfort.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you. I think along the same
Mm.
thread, we have a charity who's operating as a virtual office in Singapore. They have hired a company secretary to do all their reporting for their annual submissions. The question is, can they get their company secretary in Singapore to file an STR for them? Is that okay?
Anyone can file.
Anyone can file.
Anyone
So
can
There
file
you
a
go.
as long as the
STR, yeah.
basis for suspicion, then
Yeah. It's not just charities. Anyone can file a STR.
Okay, there you go. Interesting question, not about checks, something I have not heard for a long time. Cashier order. How to handle cashier order with substantial amount mailed to the charity without any donor information or contact. I haven't heard cashier order since the 80s. So I'm just
Yeah. I wasn't actively
Mhm.
in this part in the
Ben,
80s,
have
but
you
yeah.
ever received a donation via cashier order?
I can't recall. I mean, I didn't think it even existed.
So what he or she's trying to say is that this has just come to you and
Yeah,
there's
no
no
information. So
sender,
should they
no
just process it?
information.
Or
Right,
should
that
they
is-
just
But
STR it?
yeah, but how does where's the source? I mean,
A cashier's order would have information, but yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
you
Yeah.
would have had to,
Yeah.
the person would have had to purchase it from the bank,
Bank.
Yeah.
right? And the details would be with the bank.
The bank. Yep.
The details wouldn't be on the cashier's order itself. I think
Mm.
that's where the difficulty is.
Mm.
And the question is, if you ask the bank, would the bank actually release that
Share.
information to you, because you're actually only the payee and not the arranger of the cashier's order.
Mm.
So there is a question mark there.
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll take a few more questions. If donors are referred by board members, it might be more challenging and awkward to perform due diligence, rigorous checks, as these are their personal or friends or business contacts. So how do they approach it? Ben, I'll start with you first.
Well, I think many of our donors are referred to us by our board members. And I think in a sense that is actually easier. I mean, because the board members know they know the background of this person who they are introducing. Maybe I'm fortunate, in most cases they are owners of businesses or people who have worked with them in the past. So I think the bona fides of the donors that they bring in are in fact often easier to substantiate. But I think whether or not that is the case, I think you should still follow the rules that you have established. If a new donor who may have been recommended by a board member brings in a substantial donation which is supposed to raise the red flags in your SOP, you should do the same checks. And if there's some resistance to it, then the red flag gets redder, especially since it's the person is known. So I think you should not be distracted by the fact that it's been a person who has been introduced by the board member. Yeah, so I think you should still have this rigorous SOP. It can be simple but rigorous, and then stick to it.
Okay. I have a question for Dennis, actually. If the NPO has ring-fenced certain donations, is disclosure in the annual report or financial statement required for the ring-fence amount?
Yeah. So yes, so I think when you talk about ring fence, I mean, there's already, don't talk about AML and all this situation. There's already not natural ring fence, right? Your general funds come in, your donations, where do they go? Is it general or specific? So you already split it, right? And some you pick up and you say these are just for your operating day-to-day operations. So if those funds came in and we don't know what they are, but they've already come in and we just want to park it aside, we just make sure that it's not commingled with the rest. Right, but you still have to let your stakeholders know that there's a due process that's taking place, right? This money is sort of, is not to be touched, right? But we are doing the right checks on it, and if necessary, we take the necessary actions, right?
Yeah. I think transparency is very important.
Yep.
Last question for Danny. Will the charity be informed of the STR filing? Because this may have implications on whether they can receive donations from the same donor. So they've already filed it. The donor has come back and says, I'm going to give you another one, but there's nothing, is there any outcome? Will they know? Will the charities know if there's any outcome from the STR filing?
Not necessarily. I mean, so it just depends on if the SPF picks it up, right? And then makes inquiries and investigates further, then that's when the charity will become alerted to it. But not necessarily, because the informant, him or herself, may not inform the charity organization for whom he or she is working, right? For example, in the circumstances that we talked about with Ben regarding a board director being difficult about the reporting process, and wanting to sort of press that down and hopefully it will go away. But if an employee reports and on an anonymous basis, for example, that might or might not lead to the charity knowing. It might not lead to the charity knowing also, because it very much depends on whether further action is taken.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ben and Dennis, anything to add?
No, I think if you, on this question up there,
Yes.
so I think if, I don't know whether the interpreting the question correctly. If the charity has filed an STR and then no news from the authorities, the same donor comes back to donate,
Can they?
then I would assume that I would accept the donation.
okay.
Maybe inform the authorities that I've received another donation, because if the STR turns out nothing, and that this person is actually clean, then I would then go ahead to use the donation. So I think if the donor comes back to donate, I guess I would still accept the donation, but just make a note to the authorities that I've received another donation.
Sorry, I misunderstood the question. I mean, I agree. But I think the only caveat to that is the size and the nature of the donation and the source. I think the same questions, the basis for which red flags arose, if the same red flags exist and we're talking about large amounts of quantity, I would pick up the phone with the authorities and say, I've got my STR, I'm getting another huge chunk, I'm getting of cash or assets or whatever, and I'm very nervous. Right.
So I will check with the STR.
I would check, and I would also allow for some time to ring fence and set it aside for provisionally for a while.
Definitely we'll ring fence
Exactly.
it.
So let
Until the authorities come back and say it's clean.
let it marinate. But my spice to that question, I was just, what is the time difference between the first one and the second one? If you're talking about the next day he gives you another set of donations, then I don't think it hasn't gone through yet. Right? Because normally, based on the usual scheme of things, is that they will acknowledge receipt and but it doesn't necessarily mean that no news is good news.
Even within a couple of months, that is.
Sometimes the investigation.
If I gave $1 million, if somebody gives $1 million, and then within 6 months another $1 million comes in, and that is not consistent and doesn't resonate with a past pattern, then I think those are additional red flags.
You just
right?
have to raise.
And I would definitely
you just have to raise.
On the side of caution, as I say. So thank you very much. We actually have run over, but I'm not going to let all three of you go, because I need a key takeaway from each of you. So I'm going to start with Danny first, because you're here. A key takeaway of what you would like our audience, all our charities out there, to walk away from this webinar. They've heard so many things: STRs, SOTRs, SONA, all these things. One key takeaway.
Remember and don't panic, because there's a difference between receiving dirty money and receiving and paying out dirty money. right? So I think in the first scenario, I think it's very different in terms of risk. And I think just keep to the basics: who, what, where.
Thank you. Ben.
I tend to echo that. I think don't panic because of the recent money laundering case. Charities are in a bit of a flurry. I think it is important that charities take a step back, ensure that they have a proper financial governance framework that they have set in place, do the due diligence, and most importantly, don't become a tool of money laundering. Chances are you may from now and then receive money laundering proceeds, but that doesn't make you a launderer. So I think that is even more important.
Thank you, Ben. Dennis.
I think inaction is not a defense, right? So even if you're talking about a scenario where there may be funds already inside, which are you need to then do something to act on it, or there also may be processes, right, and improvements in your governance practices, right, and your due diligence practices and your practices of screening and so on and so forth. So I think we should also look into those and just continually make sure that we improve and raise the bar when it comes to how we want to look at the maturity of which we look at donations, right? Yeah.
Just transfer it to Pro Bono SG.
Okay, on that note, my alarm went off because it's telling me we actually went over. I want to express my deepest gratitude to our panelists for their invaluable insights and walking us through all the what ifs. A special thanks to COC Desmond Chin, Ms. Au, and Mr. Lim for their sharing. Now, to our audience, you've got to remember the learning does not stop here. Okay, if you have any queries post-webinar, don't hesitate to reach out to the MCCY Charities unit at mccy_charities@mccy.gov.sg. The team is always there to help you and guide you through your questions. And it's a great team, by the way. Thank you once again for your active participations. So many questions coming in. And we look forward to your continued collaboration in upholding the integrity of our charity sector. I think transparency, knowing your donors, asking the questions. No question is wrong or stupid. Ask if you're not sure. So always stay engaged, stay informed, and together as charities in the sector, let's make a lasting difference. Now, at the end of this webinar, a survey form will pop up on your screen for completion. We appreciate your comments and feedback, and using that, we will improve future webinars. We may want to consider having a part 2 for this because there's so much to cover. I'll make sure all 3 of you come back. And if your charity needs any legal advice, please email us at assistnpos@probono.sg. On behalf of Pro Bono SG and the Office of Commissioner of Charities, we would like to thank all our speakers again, and to our audience, thank you. Have a great week ahead.